Hello, Dr. Crum and fellow classmates. This is Tabitha Hughes, and for this week's video discussion, I'm going to be discussing Presbyterianism. So, for a brief history and overview, Presbyterianism evolved from the Protestant Reformation as an offshoot of Calvinism. Having originally developed in Scotland or having very strong roots in Scotland, it made its way to the eastern shores of America in the 1630s. Presbyterianism is known for its strong hierarchical structure within its church government. And according to Amanda Casanova, in an article she wrote for Christianity.com, their structure, their church governmental structure, would be a model that would influence the founding fathers when they began to write state constitutions and national constitutions. They would incorporate some of the Presbyterians' hierarchical structure in doing so. Presbyterians follow a confessional tradition. That means that believers reaffirm their faith by reciting things like the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, and those things are found in a book of confessions used in Presbyterian services. Now, Presbyterians have very strong fundamental core beliefs, and I'm going to go over some of those with you right now. For instance, they believe in a sovereign God and in worshiping Him. They believe that Scripture is the primary ruling for faith and life, and that the Bible is an authoritative guide. They believe that salvation comes through grace, and that while no one is deserving of grace or good enough for grace, that God freely offers grace through the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, caveat, of course, that's a little bit different than their original founding beliefs coming from Calvinism, because of course Calvinism preached predestination, and only a certain amount of saints would be sanctified and saved and called to heaven. So things have shifted in their beliefs over the years, but now in current times, this is what they believe about salvation. They do believe in the sacraments, in Holy Communion, in both infant and adult baptism. Some of the churches perform sprinkling for baptism, some do full immersion. It really depends on the church, the group that you're in. And one of their biggest beliefs, besides that God is sovereign, is in evangelicalism. As part of God's mission, they believe in evangelism, and that sharing God's message is the responsibility of the church. So knowing that, when we talk about the importance of Presbyterianism to American history, a lot of that is going to come in their evangelical efforts. So they are committed to evangelicalism and spreading the gospel. Many Presbyterian ministers and followers spread God's message by settling in the various settlements or colonies of the early American British colonies. And then, of course, as America began to move west and further into the South, the Presbyterian ministers followed, and their and settlers followed, and they very quickly established churches. The revivals of the First and Great Second Awakenings saw tremendous growing pains and shifts in the theological thinking of the Presbyterian Church. In the video lecture entitled Evangelical Reformers, Dr. Ken Cleaver discusses some of these changes and talks about how some of the theological beliefs begin to shift and how that affected the Presbyterian Church. For example, you have the split between the new lights and the old lights, and the new school and the old school. And most of this centered around whether or not the old Calvinistic tradition would continue of predestination, or whether the new thinking of individuality, that we chose grace and we chose salvation, if that would prevail, if the old tradition of church and church worship and revival would continue, or if the new tradition of revivals as advocated by Charles Finney would continue. So you do end up having several splits throughout these years, which now gives us what we have today in America, two major Presbyterian churches. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Presbyterians in American history was their commitment to spreading the gospel through their mission work with various social reform movements, such as the prison ministry, women's rights, education reform, and probably the biggie, abolitionism. Now, abolitionism, of course, being in the North, and in the South, because there were Presbyterian churches and so forth, that became kind of a fine line of how do we spread Christianity in keeping within the overall system of slavery. In the article we read this week about Charles Colcock Jones, he was very committed. He was a Presbyterian minister, very committed to his personal feelings about slavery. He was very much against slavery, but fighting a system from where he came in Georgia. He felt that rather than try to beat a system that he was not going to be able to overturn by himself, he thought that his best way to make a biracial community and to combat slavery was to Christianize both the slave owners and the slaves. One of his quotes I found very interesting. It said, "As already envisioned from general principles and commands, the sum of all is that the gospel is the gift of God to man, and those who possess it are bound to bestow it upon those who do not. Would that we all would follow this belief and bestow the gospel upon those who do not have it." Thank you.